Good evening, seekers of truth, keepers of legacy, and listeners who believe that the faces of history are not always carved in stone, but sometimes found in the fragile frame of a child who refused to be silent. Tonight, I ask you to sit with a story that does not comfort, but demands you face a truth too many try to forget. A story of apartheid's long shadows, a mother's desperate love, and a boy whose small voice thundered louder than governments and pharmaceutical giants combined. Nkosi Johnson, a name that to many was once a headline, a tragic figure used in campaigns and speeches, but behind the headlines was a living, breathing child, a boy who danced, who laughed, who called out a nation's hypocrisy and made the world look at HIV and AIDS through eyes too young to carry that burden. And tonight we confront the question, was Nkosi Johnson a child hero or a living lab rat for a world that needed a symbol but forgot the cost? Nkosi Johnson came into this world on February 4th, 1989, not under hospital spotlights, but under the long, cold shadow of a virus that had already begun its silent march through South Africa's townships and shantytowns, a march few in power wanted to name out loud. He was born Solani Nkosi, his first name meaning peace, an almost desperate prayer whispered by his mother, Nonthlanthla Daphne Nkosi, as she clutched him in her arms. But peace would be elusive for the baby born with HIV in his blood before he even drew his first breath. His mother, like millions of Black South Africans at the time, was forced to navigate two brutal realities: the open wound left by apartheid's institutional cruelty and the rising invisible enemy of the AIDS crisis that stalked the nation's poorest and most voiceless. Nonthlanthla had grown up in a world that told her she was lesser, that her life was expendable, her pain unimportant, her children's future disposable. Clinics turned women like her away, doctors often whispered blame instead of care, and the pills that could slow the virus's merciless march were priced far beyond the reach of Black mothers raising children in tin-roofed shacks. Nkosi's earliest days were marked by loss even before he could speak. His father was absent, a ghost in the story he would never get to know. His mother's health was fragile, her body already ravaged by a virus that the world, especially her own government, refused to face head-on. But if the world's systems failed Nkosi, his mother did not. Nonthlanthla did what so many mothers forced to the margins have always done. She fought like hell for her child to have a chance, any chance, at life. When Nkosi was 2, his mother could no longer hide the truth from herself. Her body could not protect him much longer. She made a decision that should break any heart listening tonight. She took her tiny boy to an AIDS care center in Johannesburg called Child Haven, a place run by volunteers and underfunded nurses who were, at that time, among the only ones daring to touch and tend to children with HIV. It was there, in that refuge of last resort, that Nkosi's path would change, a place where the unwanted and the unspoken for waited in cribs and on cots, their futures as uncertain as the politics swirling far above their heads. At Child Haven, fate intervened in the form of Gail Johnson, a white South African publicist who visited the center in the early 1990s. She saw a toddler with enormous dark eyes and a spirit that seemed to defy the diagnosis stamped on his chart. Nkosi was bright, endlessly curious, and impossible to ignore. Gail took him home, not for a day or a week, but forever. She became his foster mother, his advocate, his shield, and his megaphone. She gave him her name, Johnson, and gave him a new chance to be more than just another statistic scribbled on a chart and left to fade away. It would have been easy and maybe safer for Gail to protect Nkosi by hiding him, to keep his HIV status quiet, to avoid the stares, the whispers, the fury that came whenever a child with AIDS dared to exist in public. But that was not the path fate, or Nkosi's spirit, would allow. Because even as a toddler, even as a boy, Nkosi Johnson was born with a stubborn streak that would not stay hidden in the shadows. The virus inside him was a secret the world wanted covered up. But Nkosi would not be covered up. He would grow, he would speak, and he would carry the truth about what HIV really looked like. Not a monster or a plague, but a child who loved cartoons, who dreamed of being a dancer, who held on to life with every fragile heartbeat. So tonight, remember, Nkosi's story did not begin in front of microphones and cameras. It began in the silence of a clinic where a mother chose hope over despair. It began in a tiny body fighting to breathe in a township where too many children were buried nameless. Nkosi Johnson was born in the shadows, but he would not stay there. Next, we step forward and see how that fragile boy forced an entire country to look at him, and how he dared to demand what the powerful wanted to deny him: the right to live openly, the right to learn, the right to grow up at all. Nkosi Johnson. When Gail Johnson brought Nkosi home, she gave him more than a roof and a bed. She gave him the right to be seen. But in South Africa at the dawn of democracy, that right was far from guaranteed. The early 1990s were supposed to be a time of promise. Nelson Mandela had walked free. Apartheid's laws were falling. South Africa stood at the edge of something new. A rainbow nation, they said, where all children could stand equal under the sun. But for children like Nkosi Johnson, the rainbow stopped at the edge of a clinic door. You see, HIV/AIDS was not only a virus, it was a stigma so thick it could choke a child's future before it even began. Families hid their sick relatives, schools closed their gates, churches whispered prayers but often barred their doors. To say you were HIV positive was to say you were untouchable. Nkosi's existence defied that. He would not hide, and Gail Johnson would not let him. When Nkosi was ready for school, he wanted the same thing every child wants: to sit in a classroom, to carry a lunchbox, to write his name in big, careful letters on a piece of paper. But when Gail tried to enroll him at Melville Primary School in Johannesburg, the headmaster said no. Other parents were afraid. They claimed their children would catch it. They threatened to pull their own kids out if Nkosi was allowed in. A boy of 6, already fighting for each day of life, now forced to fight for a desk and a chair. But the thing about Nkosi was, he would not be turned away. Gail and Nkosi went public. Newspapers picked up the story: a tiny boy with dark, bright eyes standing in the doorway of a classroom he had every right to enter. South Africa's new constitution promised equality, but here it was, tested by a child with a virus. Politicians squirmed, health officials stammered. Nkosi did not. And so, under the glare of cameras with journalists scribbling notes, Melville Primary School opened its gates. Nkosi Johnson stepped inside and became the first publicly HIV-positive child to attend a South African state school. It was more than just a seat at a desk. It was a blow against fear itself. But make no mistake, the playground was not kind. Some parents whispered. Some children were told to keep their distance. Nkosi got used to questions. Will we catch it if we touch you, if you drink from our fountain? Nkosi, in his soft but clear voice, told them no. Again and again, he became an accidental teacher, a living lesson the country could not turn away from. And yet, beneath the headlines, he was still just a child. He watched cartoons with his foster brothers. He loved to dance in his room, pretending he was on a stage. He laughed at silly jokes and hated taking medicine that made him feel sick. He wore his diagnosis like a uniform the world forced on him. But in private, Nkosi still clung fiercely to moments of childhood that no virus could erase. His bravery did not come from standing at podiums, not yet. It came from something simpler: waking up each day, walking through the school gates, sitting next to other children, daring them to see him not as a threat, but as a friend. It's easy, when we make heroes of children, to forget the price they pay for our inspiration. Nkosi Johnson did not dream of fame. He dreamed of staying alive long enough to see a world where no child had to stand alone at a school gate, explaining to adults that they could not catch death from a handshake. In these moments, at that battered school desk, the seeds of an activist were planted. Nkosi didn't choose the fight, but the fight chose him, and he chose, every single day, not to hide. Next, we step onto the global stage with him, when that small voice from a classroom doorway rose up to speak truth to presidents, scientists, and pharmaceutical empires. Stay with me. Nkosi Johnson was never meant to stand behind microphones and look out at the powerful, but the path laid before him was never about what was meant to be. By the late 1990s, Nkosi's story had become more than a headline in South Africa. It was a symbol of everything wrong and everything possible at once. A child, Black, HIV positive from the townships, daring to stand in the open when so many were told to hide or die quietly. He was barely 10 when reporters started coming to the Johnson home, more than to some politicians' offices. His mother, Gail, his second mother by love and law, if not by birth, watched her boy become a reluctant ambassador, not just for himself, but for millions who had no voice. By 2000, South Africa was in the grip of a full-blown crisis. AIDS was cutting through entire communities like wildfire, yet President Thabo Mbeki's administration fumbled with pseudoscience and denial. Mbeki publicly questioned whether HIV even caused AIDS, a stance that confused policy, delayed treatment, and cost tens of thousands of lives. The world's pharmaceutical giants, meanwhile, sold life-saving antiretroviral drugs at prices so high that the people who needed them most could only watch the miracle from behind a glass wall they would never climb. In this storm, political, medical, moral, Nkosi Johnson was invited to the 13th International Conference in Durban. It was July 2000. Delegates flew in from all over the world. Scientists, presidents, activists, corporate giants, all gathered to talk about the crisis Nkosi lived every day. What they did not expect was that the conference's clearest voice would come from a boy of 11, whose body weighed little more than the folders of research papers they carried in their briefcases. Nkosi's speech would last just a few minutes, but in those minutes he did what armies of lobbyists and advisors had failed to do. He made denial shameful. Standing at that podium, so small he had to stand on a box so the microphone could reach him, Nkosi Johnson looked out over a sea of suits and serious faces and said words that still echo in the bones of this crisis. Hi, my name is Nkosi Johnson. I am 11 years old and I have full-blown AIDS. I was born HIV positive. When I was 2 years old, I was living in a care center for HIV babies in Johannesburg. My mommy was too sick to look after me. There it was. No spin, no politician's careful phrasing, just a child stating a truth that burned through all the Duke of New York. He asked the world to see what they pretended not to see. He told them, we are normal, we are human, that the children dying in silence had names, dreams, laughter, favorite colors, teddy bears. He said with that small but unshakable voice, care for us and accept us. We are all human beings. We are normal. We have hands, we have feet, we can walk, we can talk, and we have needs just like everyone else. Don't be afraid of us. We are all the same. In a single speech, Nkosi stripped away the mask of otherness that governments and fearmongers had used to justify neglect. He turned statistics back into people. Some in the audience wept, some shifted uncomfortably, some stared at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. Nkosi Johnson, 11 years old, did more than speak. He demanded. He demanded that the world do better, that South Africa stop pretending, that drug companies lower prices, that neighbors stop shunning families who dared to speak the word AIDS out loud. In that moment, Nkosi showed what it means to speak truth to power, not with slogans, but with the unarguable authority of lived experience. He spoke for the mother who died too soon, for the babies in the clinics who would never stand on any stage, for a continent too long silenced by poverty and racism and pharmaceutical profit margins. He should have been playing soccer. He should have been worrying about his homework. Instead, he stood under spotlights hotter than any child should bear, carrying the weight of an entire pandemic on his tiny shoulders. Nkosi's speech did not cure AIDS, but it cracked open the shell of silence. It fueled movements like the Treatment Action Campaign. It forced politicians to look in the mirror. It embarrassed the powerful and rallied the powerless. It also marked Nkosi as more than just a child living with HIV. It made him a symbol. And like all symbols, he would be used, celebrated, paraded, and then quietly left to bear the cost. Next, we turn to that cost, when the world's delay and denial turned a child hero into something darker, an experiment, a testament to what happens when medicine becomes a privilege instead of a right. Nkosi Johnson stood behind a podium and told the world not to be afraid, but fear, as always, did not disappear just because a child asked nicely. And neither did the systems that fed on silence and profit. After the thunderous applause at the AIDS conference faded, the cameras turned away. Nkosi went back to being what he had always been, a boy fighting a virus that devoured his tiny body from the inside out. But now he was fighting it under a magnifying glass so large it distorted everything. He was a hero, they said, but he was also a test subject in a country where pharmaceutical giants looked at townships and saw an opportunity they did not want you to see. To understand Nkosi's burden, you must understand this. At the time, powerful drug companies controlled the flow of antiretroviral treatment. The pills that could keep HIV at bay, that could turn a death sentence into a manageable condition, existed. But they cost more than a working class family's entire annual income. In rich countries, patients were living decades with HIV. In poor countries, the same virus was still a death warrant. Nkosi's face, his voice, his story, all became tools in a battle to force pharmaceutical companies to loosen their grip, to allow cheaper generic drugs, to open the door to life-saving care for millions. Campaigners used his name, and they had to. It worked. Headlines shifted. Charities raised money. International outrage swelled. But here's the cruel truth behind the headlines. For Nkosi himself, the miracle came too late. At times, the medicines were still locked behind red tape and guarded by price tags his foster mother, Gail Johnson, could not always overcome. Sometimes, Nkosi received treatments through experimental programs and pilot schemes that used his fame as leverage. Was he a hero? Yes. Was he a voice for millions? Yes. But in the darkest hours, did this child become a living symbol first and a patient second? You decide. Some call it hope. The fact that Nkosi was used in court cases, lobbying campaigns, press photos, all to save other children after him. But others ask a harsher question. Was Nkosi Johnson, the boy with 2 small shoes and 2 large eyes, a living lab rat for a global pharmaceutical industry that tested how much outrage could be monetized before the cost of mercy was lowered? Nkosi's body became the battleground where profit margins and moral imperatives collided. Pharmaceutical CEOs used his name in boardrooms, politicians used his story in speeches, activists carried his photo on protest placards. And Nkosi, he carried the pain. When new treatments were tested in South Africa, communities already gutted by poverty and stigma became convenient testing grounds. Consent was murky, oversight was often minimal. Ethics committees existed on paper, but not in the dusty streets of Soweto or the iron roof clinics of Johannesburg. Nkosi's name opened doors to medicine, but those same doors often led to rooms where side effects were downplayed, trial protocols were loosely explained, and sick bodies became bargaining chips in patent wars. Did he benefit? Sometimes. Did it save him? No. The Duke of New York, in his child's way, what was happening? His foster mother, Gail, later said he asked hard questions. Why could some people get the pills and others couldn't? Why did companies care more about money than about kids like him? No child should have to ask such questions. But Nkosi Johnson was never given the luxury of being just a child. He was the proof, the living proof, of how the world could abandon its most vulnerable and then parade them as inspiration when convenient. And yet, and this is where his story refuses to bow to despair, Nkosi never let bitterness eat him alive, the way HIV ate at his cells. He spoke up until his last breath for children like him. He forced lawsuits, he forced negotiations, he forced the mask off a system that treated the dying poor as test subjects and the wealthy sick as paying clients. So tonight, when we ask the question, was Nkosi Johnson a living lab rat? The answer is uncomfortable. Maybe he was. But even if the world tried to use him, to test him, to package him as pity, Nkosi Johnson fought to be more than that. He was the face in the boardroom projector slide, and he was the reason activists chained themselves to courthouse gates. He was the quiet patient in a clinic chair, and he was the reason life-saving medicine is more affordable today for millions who would otherwise be dead. In the end, he turned the tables. The lab rat spoke. The patient fought back. The symbol grabbed the microphone and bit the hand that tried to use him in silence. Next, we face what happened when that small, brave body could hold on no longer. When Nkosi Johnson, the living proof of the crisis, became another name on a tombstone far too soon. Stay with me. Nkosi Johnson's battle was never just against a virus. It was a fight waged on multiple fronts. The physical pain, the public scrutiny, the political indifference, and the relentless stigma that clung to him like a shadow. As Nkosi grew older, the disease tightened its grip. The antiretroviral treatments that might have prolonged his life were patchy at best, subject to availability, affordability, and bureaucratic obstacles that no child should ever have to navigate. Despite the relentless progression of AIDS, Nkosi refused to be defined solely by illness. His spirit burned bright, lighting the way for others even as his body weakened. But the final years were brutal. He faced opportunistic infections, bouts of severe illness, and exhaustion. There were days when the child who once stood tall on a conference stage was too weak to rise from bed. His foster mother, Gail Johnson, was his steadfast guardian, protector, and voice, fighting on multiple fronts to ensure that Nkosi's legacy wasn't just remembered for his illness, but for the powerful message he left behind. In 2001, Nkosi faced a personal battle that put the spotlight on the deep inequalities of South Africa's healthcare system. He was denied admission to a state hospital because of his HIV status, a brutal reminder that the stigma and discrimination he had fought against all his life were still alive, even in the places designed to protect the sick. Public outrage erupted, but Nkosi had already become a symbol beyond just a medical patient. He was a rallying cry for change. His courage forced hospitals and policymakers to confront their prejudices and to reconsider the way care was delivered to HIV-positive individuals. His death was mourned not only in South Africa but around the world. It was a moment of reckoning, a stark reminder of the cost of denial, delay, and discrimination. The Duke of New York. But even in death, Nkosi's voice refused to be silenced. His final wish, that all children born with HIV receive treatment and a chance to live, became a rallying point for global activism. Organizations dedicated to fighting HIV/AIDS invoked his name to demand access to affordable medications, better healthcare policies, and a dismantling of the stigma that still shackled millions. His last days remind us that even in the face of death, courage can inspire a world to change. In the end, Nkosi did more than survive. He changed the course of history by living out loud, refusing to hide, and demanding that humanity see him, and all children like him, not as victims, but as warriors. Next, we look at the ripples left in Nkosi's wake, the legacy of a boy who lived too briefly, but whose voice echoes through time, changing hearts, laws, and lives forever. Stay with me. Nkosi Johnson's legacy is not carved into granite monuments or taught in every classroom, but it lives wherever the fight for human dignity and access to medicine continues. Because of Nkosi, because of his voice, because of the price he paid, South Africa and the world were forced to change. Antiretroviral drugs became more accessible. Governments were pressured to abandon denialism. And the image of a boy demanding his right to live remains a rallying cry for millions who still battle stigma and indifference. Nkosi once said, "Do all you can with what you have in the time you have in the place you are." He did, and it broke him. But it also changed the world. So tonight, I ask you, who suffers in silence now, waiting for us to see them, not as symbols, not as burdens, but as human beings? You have been listening to Faces of History with me, the Duke of New York. Remember this, the faces of history are often the smallest, the quietest, the ones we almost overlook. Look closely, you might see your own reflection. Good night.